So hello and welcome to a very special edition here on Mr. Gill's Science Stuff. This actually marks a very important moment in this YouTube channel. It is exactly 1 year since we started doing this. That's right, folks. We have fully looped round the curriculum and come back to where we started. If you have a look elsewhere on the channel, and I'm going to leave it up for posterity's sake, you will find this lesson done 1 year ago. Now the science hasn't changed, but the technology certainly has. So I'm planning to do this again, but I'm going to do something a little bit new for posterity's sake, is just intersperse some bits of yesterme, right? Stood in front of a whiteboard trying to film a screen on my phone when all this first kicked off. So as I say, the technology's come on a long way in a year, right? With over 200 videos and over 200 subscribers now. So that's absolutely fantastic, I think. Thank you very much for the support that you've given. And this is on species, types of selection and evolution. So it is a combination of present me and yesterme. You're going to talk you through how we got to be what it is that we are. Okay, so let's crack on. It looks like there's quite a bit of syllabus here, and there is, but of course a lot of it you've done very thoroughly at GCSE level. Okay, the idea of natural selection and evolution should not be new. So if we look up here, the idea of genetic diversity is really important. The idea of what we mean in terms of numbers and frequencies, in terms of genetic diversity and in terms of allele frequencies. Okay, that's sort of how we bring this up to A-level standards in terms of language and in terms of numeracy. Okay, the principles, as you can see, are basically the same as at GCSE. Random mutations, many are harmful, some are useful, selection, and that kind of thing. The only thing you have to add in here is new terminology to talk about allele frequency within populations. This bit here is the new bit, applying this to normal distributions, types of selection that alter the frequency of the alleles within a population and representing that as part of a normal distribution. That is new. And then obviously here, should go without saying, but it is specifically mentioned on the syllabus, that these adaptations don't always mean predator-prey relationships, running bigger, faster, stronger. Fitter, survival of the fittest, means whatever it is that makes you fitter for the environment. And those adaptations can be anatomical, physiological, or behavioural. And we'll get into that in just a moment. So here's a species concept that you already know, right? You've done this before, and if you're not familiar with this, I suggest you go back to the GCSE version of the natural selection stuff and have a watch through that, maybe on double speed, to get yourself up to speed. That's quite a detailed playlist, that one, so I would highly recommend going and watching that. I was quite pleased with it when I put that together. So a group of individuals genetically similar enough to reproduce and produce viable offspring is our species concept. And what we mean by that is if two organisms can reproduce and produce offspring that then can reproduce themselves, we would say that is a species. It's not a perfect concept. Again, for all the edge cases, have a look at that GCSE example, but it's good enough. Okay, so the examples I gave back then, things like this, the Great Dane and the pug, we know them both to be the same species, they're both dogs, and indeed if you used artificial insemination, got an egg, got a sperm, put them together, they could make a hybrid that would be fertile itself. They might struggle on their own for purely mechanical reasons. And then up here we've got our two tulips. They look very different. They're displaying a lot of variation, which is of course the point of this module. But if you got the pollen, got the egg, they would produce a seed that would grow into a new plant that could itself then produce seeds, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's our species concept. You should be familiar with it. If you're not, go back and revise that. And again, here's something else you should be familiar with: natural selection. Now, you probably learnt this with only the fit survive, only the strongest survive, but it could be the strong. It also could be the smart, the tall, the small, the immune, the fast, the attractive. Right, and that's where we get this up to A-level standard, is what do we actually mean in terms of fitness, right? What does that mean, okay? The fitness I always think of as just fitting the environment. It could be an anatomy, that the biggest is the best, right? And big, strong muscles and teeth and claws and things, right? And that could make you the fittest for your environment. It could also be physiological. It could be something biochemical inside your body. So one group of organisms will be better at digesting a certain type of food, or resisting a certain toxin, or resisting something else in the environment, surviving particular colds, particular hot, or particularly humid, or particularly wet, particularly dry environments. These could be physiological adaptations, or if you think of something like the birds of paradise on Papua New Guinea, it could be behavioural, right? The only way they manage to successfully mate is by attracting a female, and the way they do that is through mating dances. okay? And the ones that produce the best performances, that have the best mating dances, get to mate and get to pass their genes on. That is a behavioural adaptation that gets passed down. Working as groups, teamwork, cooperation, these things are behavioural adaptations, and they also get passed on and add to an organism's fitness. So we've got to broaden out what we think of as being the fittest for A-level standard, okay? So survival of the fittest, as we say, best adapted animal will survive better, pass on its genes, pass on a particular allele of its genes, and they will then pass down the generation. We know that, we're not going to stick around, but basically, so the generation next will have the better adapted alleles, the better traits, the better versions of those genes to survive in that environment. Okay, so in terms of language, fitness, we've just said, is the ability to survive in a habitat in whatever form that comes. Behavioural, anatomical, physiological, doesn't matter, right? Fitness, if you fit the environment and you're the best at surviving in it. Selection pressure is basically any aspect of that environment that impacts survival, and that's a term you might not have used at GCSE. What are the selection pressures within the environment? If the environment gets hotter, that is a selection pressure, and a lot of animals are not able to cope with that at the moment, with the warming temperature. In fact, there's some fantastic research just published via Operation Wallacea conservation group to show that a lot of animals are actually moving to higher altitudes as the temperature in tropical forests gets hotter, okay? So they're having a selection pressure, and their range, if you like, gets moved to a higher altitude. It could also be that we have altered the selection pressure. For example, taking antibiotics changes the environment for a bacteria, and that is a selection pressure, and we're basically pushing the organisms towards being able to survive in that environment, okay? So selection pressure in that way. So where does variation come from? Again, this is stuff you should already know, so I'm not going to linger too much on it. We've already done a lesson on mutations and mistakes, where they come from, generating different alleles of the genes. We know this bit, variation equals competition. I'll revisit a couple of examples in a moment. And we also know the alleles giving better features for that environment are then passed on, and the others die out. Okay, so that's a rehash of GCSE, but the examples are still the same, but you have to be very, very specific in the language at A level, right? You use the terms alleles, mutations. What are you talking about, right? So these are the classics, aren't they? The grey squirrel, red squirrel. We know this is an American import that's come over and actually is better adapted for most UK environments than the red squirrel because it's bigger, right? It's got an anatomical adaptation. It's bigger. It's better at getting food. It's got a physiological adaptation in that it is more resistant to particular diseases that it carries that the red squirrel is not. Okay, it's behavioural. It's better at taking over territories, better at building nests, all that kind of stuff. So in areas where you've got the grey squirrel and the red squirrel, in most circumstances, the grey squirrel wins out because it is more fit for the environment. However, in areas where we have lots of natural UK predators, things like pine martens, the red squirrel survives better because the red squirrel, being light and thin, is able to escape a predator by running to the end of a really thin branch that it can sit on quite happily, but a big fat sort of weasel-like creature, the pine marten, can't. Old fatty here can't do that, so in an area with lots of predators, this one gets predated on more than that one. So in that case, this would be the fitter example. And the other example you will have all done is the peppered moth. You know this story. This is a silver birch tree. This is the peppered moth here. Obviously, there's an allele for pigmentation that makes it peppered, which is very good camouflage. This is an allele for black, which obviously means it's going to be predated on by birds more. Industrial Revolution comes on, changes all the tree bark to being black in colour, and the frequency of the allele in the population, right, for the black moves up and the peppered moves down. Then the Clean Air Act comes in, most silver birch trees go back the other way, and the allele frequencies change again, right? Evolution or natural selection you can see happening in real time. And that is another term you are expected now at A-level to use. Allele frequency. Put some numbers to this. What percentage of the population contain what version of the allele? We all know a helpful mutation is quite rare. A proportion of the population with the helpful allele we refer to as the allele frequency, and helpful ones rise, detrimental ones fall. Okay, and if you get to a proportion of the population of 1, right, have the allele, then we say that that allele is fixed. So over time, helpful allele spreads to 100% of the population. We then refer to it as fixed, right? Basically repeat that with lots of different alleles, with lots of different genes, and you have the process of evolution over time. A really good example of that was literally just yesterday, where there was a news story saying that the Kent variation of the COVID-19 virus is going to become the world's dominant strain, they reckon, because it suffered a mutation, right, that makes it more able to move from human to humans, makes it more transmissible. That makes it fitter in the environment of trying to attack humans. But the good news about the way viruses tend to evolve is that if they kill humans, if they kill their hosts, that is not a good survival strategy. What they want is a healthy enough human wandering around and spreading them to other people, and a good ability to move between people. So over time, what tends to happen is viruses get less pathogenic but more transmissible, and that's what we're seeing with COVID-19 as well. And it's just another example of exactly the same principles that we're talking about here. Okay, so genetic diversity, of course, is a different measurement than number of individuals within a species, size of population. What it means is the number of different alleles of genes within a population. Okay, so that's allele frequency or genetic diversity. Okay, so you could have a population of 100 organisms that had 100 different alleles for a certain gene. That is a very, very diverse genetically population. You could then have a population of 10,000 organisms that had one allele for a particular gene. That is not a very diverse population. Okay, so more diversity is good because if the environment changes, you've probably got something for natural selection to work with. You've got an allele that's going to be more advantageous than others. If everybody's got the same alleles and the environment changes, that is a very vulnerable population. Okay, so on that note, I'll take you back to the Galapagos Islands, which I'm sure you will have talked about at GCSE. Okay, so the Galapagos Islands are not only a fantastic example of like inspiration for Darwin, but they illustrate this point about genetic diversity hugely, because while they are an amazing natural wonder, the genetic diversity of the Galapagos Islands is actually incredibly low, right? Because very few creatures, respectively, comparatively speaking, made it from mainland South America over to the Galapagos Islands. There's not a lot of raw material, not a lot of genes there for evolution to work on, for natural selection to work on. So, right, and that picture, by the way, I took in 2014. That's me, and I did pose that picture deliberately with this kind of lesson in mind. That's me stood on the very northern point of San Cristobal Island, so-called Punta Pit, doing a pose that's supposed to indicate me considering genetic diversity and evolution. I hope it worked. It's also incumbent on you, if you go to the Galapagos Islands, of course, to see the wildlife, one of the most famous being the giant tortoises, and to take yourself a good number of selfies, right? It's the 1-year anniversary lesson. You can put up with the jokes, right? Got to take lots of selfies, okay? So these are giant tortoises, and they're amazing creatures, but they are terrible at their environment, right? They're not as good as some of the things we have on mainland South America, in Europe. What they do is they graze, right? So they're grazing animals, they're herbivores that go around. And you might know the thing about the shell, that you can actually see which island a tortoise is from by the shape of its shell. It has to reach up to reach sort of things it can graze on high up, cactuses, that kind of stuff from a dry island. Then it will have a little dimple, so-called saddle, in its shell. If it grazes off the ground, it will have just a smooth shell there, right? You might know that. But when the first sailors got there and actually released goats onto the island, because they figured they'd come back round and there'd be more goats for them to eat, goats are much, much better herbivores, much better grazers than the Galapagos tortoises, okay? So goats obviously were better at getting food from their environment, and also the sailors tended to eat the tortoises because they'd stay fresh on boats for a very long time. And that is a recipe due to their low genetic diversity, meaning an inappropriate organism has adapted to that niche for extinction, okay? If you want a really sad story, look up Lonesome George, right, the Galapagos tortoise. But there we go. And this ridiculous creature is another example of that. This is a marine iguana. This is an iguana, so a cold-blooded animal that feeds by basically warming its body up in the sun until it's so hot it's nearly dead. So you can see it's evolved to be very dark in pigment to warm up faster, right, like a storage heater, right? And then it dives into the sea, where basically its body temperature starts to plummet, swims down to the bottom, grazes on very low nutrient kelp and seaweed, all that kind of stuff. And it does that, gorges itself as fast as it can on one breath until it's nearly dead from cold, and then comes back up and has to haul itself up the rocks again as its body's cooling down, almost doesn't have the strength to get back up the rocks, right? Has to haul itself back up again so that it can then warm its body back up again so it can digest its food, eject its salt, right, all this excess salt from this food through its eyes, warm itself up till it's pretty much dead again, and repeat. that is an inappropriate animal for that niche. But it's because of the low genetic diversity of the Galapagos Islands that you end up with these inappropriate animals adapting to this environment. Okay, so that's what we mean. So the Galapagos Islands doesn't actually show very high genetic diversity. What it does show is rareness, or so-called endemism, lots of endemic species, and that, and the history and the story with Darwin, is why it's such an important place for nature. Okay? So, and as a last sort of point on this, this is a picture I took across a valley over to a cliff face. The Chilean botanist named Hugo we were with basically went, oh, look at those over there. That's a particular species of a plant called Scalicia. Oh, okay, great. He goes, that's all of them. I was like, what, all of them here? All of them on the island? He said, no. It's 123 plants over there, and that's all of them in the world. Really? Because this is a cliff face that could be colonised by life, but there weren't the normal plants there to do it. So this very, very unusual event has taken place where these plants have evolved in the absence of competition to colonise this cliff, okay? And that is all those examples of that particular species in the world. If another species from elsewhere on the planet was introduced, they would be wiped out almost immediately, okay? But it's not often you can take one photo across a little valley and see every individual in a particular species on the planet. So high endemism, low genetic diversity on the Galapagos. One of the reasons why it is such a vulnerable and delicate ecosystem. Okay, moving on. Now we're going into types of selection. So how does allele frequency change over time if we introduce different selection pressures? Okay, that's what we're talking about here. And you're expected to be able to interpret standard deviations and averages on a normal distribution. Okay, and for this bit, I'm going to hand back over to Yes-to-me to tell you about directional selection. Now this occurs when there's selection pressure for a species in response to a change in the environment. So we're thinking classic predator-prey relationships, things getting faster, things sort of the slowest ones dying, fastest ones surviving, and so on and so forth. So our example here, of course, is bacterial resistance to antibiotics. We put a directional pressure on their environment and they change to respond. Okay, so I'll hand over now to Yes-to-me from 1 year ago, this very day, 1 year ago, to tell you all about directional selection. So types of selection rely on you knowing what we mean by a normal distribution. That's this shape here, okay? Now what that means, what that's showing, a normal distribution basically says that the data from whatever sort of set you've got, okay, whatever sort of trait you're looking at, it could be height, it could be speed, it could be IQ, it could be pigmentation, it could be the amount of chlorophyll that a plant produces, it could literally be anything, right? Varies, where the most extreme cases have got the lowest frequency. So this axis here is frequency, okay? There are hardly any of the shortest people in the world, hardly any of the tallest people in the world. Most people, if you measured their height, would be somewhere around the middle, okay? Now, in terms of selection, in terms of a population, there are a number of things that can happen to this normal distribution if the environment changes. The first one is if a selection pressure comes on that favours one end of the normal distribution and not the other. So for example, let's say this was speed. So you've got the cheetah and the gazelle, classic example. Fastest cheetah, fastest gazelle are more likely to survive and they're more likely to reproduce. The slowest cheetah, the slowest gazelle are less likely to survive and they're going to die out. So over time, what happens to your normal distribution is this end gets much lower. So this gets flat, 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 flat. The normal distribution ends up coming up over here because, of course, if any of them are breeding, it's these ones over here. So now we have a new average, which is up there. That has moved in a particular direction. Hence we say directional selection. just basically to give you some other examples of that, we might have something like butterflies, right, which get more and more elaborately coloured over time as the females become more and more choosy. There's another little species of fish called a guppy that does this as well. If you take predators out of the equation, the males over a very small number of generations become more and more heavily pigmented, more brightly coloured, all that kind of stuff. That's very rapid directional sexual selection, because it turns out the females like a brightly coloured male. Okay, and of course the old chestnut, the old classic, the neck of the giraffe. Okay, so the idea that the tallest ones survive, the shortest ones die, that is directional selection. So the average height of a giraffe moves in a single direction, that is directional selection. Okay, pretty straightforward. Next one is called stabilising or normalising selection. This is when the environment doesn't change, okay? The environment doesn't change, so there's no pressure for a well-adapted species to change. So in this case, the average is the best, and being on the extremes of the normal distribution is bad. The example used on the syllabus is birth weight of humans. Thank you very much, AQA. Apologies, ladies, but that's the example they've used, that you basically need to be average size. Too small, you can't fit a brain in a head. Right, too big, the baby isn't getting through a birth canal and it's going to kill both itself and mum. Okay, that is not good. Right, so I'm going to hand back over now to Mr. Gill from 1 year ago to explain to you how stabilising selection affects the normal distribution. Sometimes the environment doesn't change. So what you end up with is a thing called stabilising selection, where you have your original normal distribution, just the same, with its original average right there. Now in this instance, it's not an advantage to deviate from the environment, from the average at all. So the environment's very stable over a long period of time. It doesn't change. There's no pressure for a well-adapted animal to change. So classic examples for this would be the deep ocean, which hasn't changed in millions and millions of years. So essentially, if an animal's very good at surviving, the average is really good, then what you end up with is anything down here is killed, anything up here is killed, because it's not a good idea to deviate from the average. And so over time, your normal distribution simply gets narrower. So the average doesn't change, but the standard deviation does. Okay, thank you, yes to me. I personally prefer this organism as an example of normalising, stabilising selection, and I know yes to Mr. Gill agrees with me, right, which is called the coelacanth. Now here it is, look, it's a 90 million year old fossilised fish found in the fossil record, thought to be long since extinct because of being found obviously in a fossil, right? And in the early 1900s, when trawler technology was getting better, imagine people's surprise when up dredges this little fella. Right? This is a living coelacanth. As you can see, it's barely changed for 90 million years. Okay? The idea there is that the deep sea has been a very, very stable environment. It hasn't changed. So the selection pressures hasn't changed. So what's fitness for that environment hasn't changed either. Right? The idea being, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Okay? So any extremes would die and the average survives better. Right, those two are the ones on your syllabus. This one is not, but it is a precursor to speciation, so we mention it at the very end. Disruptive or diverging selection, when there's a dramatic change in the environment that favours two extremes of a characteristic. For example, contamination introduced into an environment affecting plants. So this always used to be a case study on biology, but copper contamination from the output of Welsh mines, right? So for disruptive or diverging selection, I'll hand you back over to past me for the last time. In the middle, we've got our average, and then something catastrophic happens to the environment. Something very, very different takes place, where the average is no longer any good, right? So the average here dies off, right? And the extremes, for some reason, have an advantage. What happens then is our extremes start to rise, our average starts to drop, and our extreme starts to rise again. So in this instance, the reason it's called diverging, right, or disruptive, is that we get two new averages. One moves out this way, and one moves out that way. And eventually, if this hits 0, it's a significant step towards the formation of two new similar but distinct species. Okay, how things have changed in a year. So again, this is a good example, but another really good example is Galapagos finches. Okay, Galapagos finches are an example of, a classic example of disruptive selection. So they all come from one South American ancestor species blown across to the Galapagos Islands and obviously landing on different islands. Therefore, being average wasn't good because the different islands had different food sources. So you needed a big beak if you're eating nuts, cracking those. Then you needed a little fine beak if you wanted to get into wood, pull out bugs, all that kind of stuff. You needed a different type of beak for fruit, so on and so forth. Now, that is an example of disruptive speciation or disruptive selection, and as you're probably aware, it's why we've got all these different species of Galapagos finch, right? Because it's a precursor to the formation of two non-interbreeding groups, right? To return to our species concept. But of course, nowadays, right, because more people are going there's more humans and there's bread for them to have, that they will actually land on your sandwich, much like a seagull, and try and steal the food out of your hands, okay? You can see there's a Galapagos finch there looking at one of my students with a beak full of bread going, protected species, what are you going to do? Okay, so in summary, those are our three types of selection. We've got directional, we've got stabilising, and we've got disruptive. The first two are on your syllabus. Directional, where one extreme is better than the other, so the average moves up. Okay, stabilising selection, where average is good and the extremes are bad, so the average stays the same, but the standard deviation might shrink. And then, not on your syllabus, but quite easy to get your head around, disruptive selection, where something drastic happens, the middle is no longer suitable and only the extremes are, and that is a precursor to speciation. So thank you very much for watching for one full year of Mr. Gill's science stuff. If you have any suggestions for what we should cover or how this should progress, whether the technology is actually an improvement or not, please do let me know. As a special birthday treat, I will leave the comments open on this one. Thank you very much for watching, and just to keep my students happy, because they've been asking why I don't, like and subscribe. If you've got any comments or suggestions, keep it clean, please put them in the comments or drop me a line. Thanks very much. See you again soon.